So tell me more about the failure value cycle.
So the failure value cycle is a 7-stage cycle that came out of the work that we did, the research that we did to write our book. Let me go back and just share just a little bit of context on the book. So I described that it really came out of looking at Silicon Valley and saying, how do we take the lessons from Silicon Valley, from the San Francisco Bay Area and startups, and apply them more broadly across businesses, small, medium, and large? How do we take a look at it that way? So John and I went out and we talked to hundreds of executives. We looked at hundreds of additional companies, small, medium, and large. And then we talked to executives and leaders in other disciplines, in entertainment, in government, in disciplines like space travel. We talked to astronauts and fighter pilots across a whole discipline to understand how failure plays a role in driving innovation, in driving growth, in driving new ways of doing things. And through that, we saw patterns emerge. What we didn't want to do was just to create another memoir, like I failed, I persevered, I succeeded, the Steve Jobs story. That's great, but that's not that helpful. We didn't want to create yet another Silicon Valley lean startup clone about how to learn from failure if you're a startup, to fail fast, fail forward, fail smarter, fail whatever. And we didn't want to create a self-help book, I need a hug, I failed kind of thing. So those three were off the table. The key thing here was, what patterns do we see in failure that the broader spectrum of leaders, executives, and others can put to work? So that's the backdrop. And out of that, a number of patterns emerged, and we distilled it down to 7 key steps. And I'll walk through them really briefly, see if I've got them all right. The first one is to respect the fact that failure happens a lot. It's much more of a reality than we often think it is. It's kind of like gravity. It's around us all the time, pulling us down. We have to recognize that and learn to leverage it. Secondly, it's to rehearse for failure. And if you think about that, you want to rehearse for 2 particular types of failure. The first are failures that might happen a lot. Let's say that you have a new product launch. You might expect that some things won't work and your customer service people better be ready for it. The second is that failure that could be fundamentally existential, that could threaten the life of your company, like VW is facing right now based on this massive failure that they've had. The third is to recognize it early. Put in place warning systems. Look outside your sector. Put in place automated or big data diagnostics that may capture slight changes in trends or directions that enable you to earlier be able to respond and react to the problem. The fourth stage is to react in the moment, as we talked about with Netflix. When a failure happens, do you react effectively and quickly? And when necessary, does leadership step up, take responsibility, and if needed, apologize? Because sometimes that's appropriate. And then the 5th stage is to reflect upon that. When we have a failure, the thing that we most want to do is to fix it right away. And what's hard, and this is the advice that I give to leaders, is to say, don't always jump to fix it. Take a moment to reflect on what just happened, because there may be learnings embedded in there that you want to incorporate in your response as opposed to just putting a Band-Aid on it. As we saw with Netflix, they actually changed direction. The 6th out of our 7 stages is to rebound, and that's when you move from defense into offense. And you say, what is it now that we need to do operationally to execute our new strategy, or to redouble our efforts on our existing strategy if you say, look, we just ran into a headwind. And then finally, the 7th stage is to remember failure so you don't make those same failures again. And one of the things that I often like to say around this is, do you ask questions in the right order? One of the questions that's often the first question that's asked when there's a failure is, whose fault is it? Which immediately creates an environment of blame. What if instead you said, what just happened? Why did it happen and how did it happen? And once you've determined that, then you say, now who was involved and how can we involve them in the recovery effort, in the next steps? Because you know that those people, first of all, they know the most about it, and they are the most motivated to be able to take those learnings and put them to work. So that's our 7-stage failure value cycle that John and I developed.
Should there be then, given all that you've said, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. Should there be a culture embracing the fact that failure happens? Should leaders be talking to their teams and their people about, it's going to happen, let's embrace it, this is good?
So we don't necessarily advocate throwing failure parties per se, but we do recognize, I recognize that it's important to say there are parts of the business where you do need to encourage failure. Let's say we're talking about new product development or marketing campaigns. If you want improvement, if you want innovation, you have to take risks, you have to change. And if you do those especially aggressively enough, a number of those are going to fail. You have to expect that failure is a natural outgrowth of trying to innovate and change and evolve. Because you know that the startups that are after the business that every enterprise has are not afraid to fail. The failure rates on startups are huge. Somewhere between 75 and 90% fail, and they go in knowing that. So that's all right. Now, if you as an enterprise are afraid to fail, I talk to CEOs and they say, we want innovation and growth, but we just can't afford to fail. Well, then you've got the math wrong on that one.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about static quo. How does that relate to this idea?
Well, we can talk about the status quo, but if we call it the static quo instead, it's the place in which we are stuck right now. And
is that from a fear of failure, though?
It's a fear. It is. It is a fear of failure. It is a comfort with the current situation. And if we compare the static quo inside enterprises versus entrepreneurs who welcome change, drive change, are ready to knock you off that pedestal, then what I like to say is think about your future quo, not your static quo. And how do you bring that future quo, that desired future state, into being? And by the way, there will be some failures between now and then.